I want to submit something to you that I think is important to say, and I'm not the first who said it, but I believe in it more and more as I learn more and more and spend more and more time as a rabbi. Shabbat really is the cornerstone of the Torah. It really is, I would say, the foundation of Judaism. You know I'm not the first one to say this. The famous phrase by Achad Ha'am, more than the Jews have kept the Sabbath has kept the Jews. We see that playing out in front of us on a regular basis in Jewish life. That people who understand the Sabbath, who understand its importance, who try their best to observe it in the best way that they can, it doesn't just keep them Sabbath observant, it keeps them Jewish. Why? The most important principle of Sabbath observance is the idea that the human being is more than his or her productivity. That is the basis of the Sabbath. That is why the Sabbath is so tied in to the Exodus from Egypt. When we say the Kiddush, Zecher Litziat Mitzrayim. Many people don't understand the connection because Shabbat was in the Torah, ordained in the Torah, all the way at the beginning. What is the relationship between that day and the Exodus from Egypt? It is because the experience of our ancestors in Egypt was one that conveyed an Egyptian idolatry, which is that you are only as good as you are useful. And when you're no longer useful, you're no good anymore. The Sabbath's main idea is you are more than your productivity, you are more than your usefulness, and that in order to live that way, you are responsible for making a delineation in your life. Only one day out of 7 where you say, I will not participate in the economic, industrial systems that govern the world. That economic, industrial system, or those systems which govern the world, have only grown increasingly close, right? Trying to take over our time in much more extreme ways than those systems have in the past. When you speak to people today who are active in work life, they talk about there being no boundaries between their private time and their work time. They talk about the inability to make any distinction in their lives between the two, and certainly not any time to include a time for just spirituality and to be left alone, right? And so I think more than ever, it is a good idea to remind the community about the importance of Shabbat. It is good for Judaism. I think it's good for you individually, and it's good for the whole community. Having a space where we are together, where we're called to be together, to be in community, is necessary in order to sustain community. When there's no time for people to be together and to do the things that Jews do together, we break apart. We sometimes struggle to find that peace and that sensitivity within Shabbat. But once in a while, just speaking from personal experience, and you're sitting here together and you're celebrating somebody's birthday, or you're watching somebody else's bar mitzvah, and you get it. It starts to make sense to you. Yeah, the Shabbat really is important. It's nice and it adds something to my life and helps bring a community together, and it's nice that people care about the joys of others in the community, And maybe even more importantly, it's nice that people care when I'm going through tough times and that I have a place to be where I feel strengthened and sustained. Shabbat, as a cornerstone of Jewish observance, right, is what is behind this whole discussion. And what has in the past led to some controversial decisions about the best ways to observe Shabbat in the modern world. And last year, the Conservative Movement's Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, which is a special group of rabbis who are very knowledgeable in Jewish law and members of the conservative movement, decided to take up this question of maybe finding leniencies in the usage of an electric vehicle on Shabbat to encourage more people to come to synagogue. But it's not just to encourage more people to come to synagogue. It's also to acknowledge that Shabbat observance ought to be seen by all of us as a spectrum. You see, in some communities, they look at Shabbat observance as all or nothing. Are you Shomer Shabbos? Yes or no? And it's unfortunate because we should not look at Shabbat as a everything or nothing endeavor. There are pieces of Shabbat observance that you might decide to observe because that's what's meaningful to you, and others that you might say, I'm not there yet, maybe I'll get there one day. For instance, maybe it's a day where I'm not going to go shopping. Maybe it's just the day where I'm going to turn off my phone. Maybe it's the day where I'm going to make it crucial that I have that Friday night dinner with my family and that I never make other plans. Each one is valuable on its own. We should always remember that. And that's why this responsum is helpful, or this issue is helpful. Because there are some people who say, I may not be at my level of observance yet where I'm walking to synagogue. I think when you live a lifestyle where you're walking to synagogue, you start to appreciate how important that is. Because when you're living in a big city with a lot of traffic and a lot of terrible drivers, which is our experience 6 days of the week, it's really nice to have a break. When you're walking, life moves at a slower pace, and you actually pay attention to things that you miss when you're driving by at 70 kilometers an hour. Walking to shul is beautiful. The point of this class is not to tell those who are walking to shul that they should start to drive. All of the opinions said it's best to walk. But let's say you're not living in walkable distance. There are those who asked, maybe it's better that I take an electric car rather than drive. That's becoming very important in urban centers since real estate prices in major North American Jewish centers have skyrocketed, and we find people who want to observe Shabbat unable to afford housing in the places where most of the synagogues are built in these urban centers, which tends to be more in expensive areas of the city. It's certainly true for us at Beth Tikvah. So, acknowledging that observance is somewhere on a spectrum, how do we consider the operation of an electric vehicle? Is it better for me to buy a Tesla for my next car if Shabbat observance is important to me than to buy a regular car? In order to understand where the opinions will fall out at the end of the day, I think it's important to review the laws of Shabbat. But that could take me years. So I'm just going to give you a kitzur, a summary of the laws of Shabbat, which I think is helpful whether you're interested in an electric vehicle or not, because electrical devices surround us everywhere, and it's important to know how the Torah understands the prohibition against work on Shabbat. Sometimes I'll ask a conversion student, what are we not allowed to do on Shabbat? And they'll say what most people say, which is, you're not allowed to work. And that's the biggest fallacy that's out there. It's not true that you're just not allowed to work. There's some works that are allowed, and there are some things that are not considered, in common parlance, work, that are not allowed. The word that is used is melacha in the Torah to describe the forbidden labors. Kol melacha lo ta'asu. And you see on the handout, right there, the first line, that the highest level of forbidden work, the strictest sense of what is a forbidden labor, that is referred to as melacha. There's lots to say about melacha. Last week's parsha, the beginning of the construction of the sanctuary, the opening lines of it are a reminder not to do melacha. Since the rest of the parsha is about the building of the sanctuary, and this week's parsha too, the rabbis deduce from that melacha must mean all the acts of construction that were employed in the building of the Mishkan, of the sanctuary. Does everyone understand that? Since that section begins with, don't do any melacha, but now I'm commanding you to build the sanctuary, the rabbis make a logical inference which might be correct or might be incorrect. I say it might be incorrect because the Torah never really explains precisely what melacha is. That is the whole source of the problem. There are some labors that are mentioned explicitly. They include kindling a flame, lo teva'aru eish b'yom haShabbat. That's Exodus 35. Plowing, harvesting, reaping, gathering wood, baking, cooking, carrying a burden out of your house, wine presses, bringing in the corn, loading it on donkeys, transporting it, and buying and selling. But it's not clear that the Torah, in explaining those things, is saying, these are the list of things that you can't do. What most biblical scholars will say is that the Torah purposefully does not explain what melacha is, because in the Bible, Shabbat is more of a spiritual thing than it is about particular laws. That is, you know what you do during the 6 days of the week. You know what you're busy with. The Torah doesn't need to tell you what you're busy with. You already know. And whatever it is that you're busy with, don't do it on the seventh day. That's melacha in the Torah. It is not melacha as the rabbis understand it centuries later. And you see why it's not. The rabbis say, you are giving us, they call it harerei teluyim base'ara. You're giving us a mountain to build out of a hair, or hanging from a hair. What they mean is, we need to make sure that we understand what we're allowed to do and what we're not allowed to do. That is a mountain. And you're giving us, the Torah gives us nothing but a hair to hang all of those laws on. So they come up rabbinic Judaism, the rabbis, I'm talking about the Mishnah and the Talmud, 2nd, 3rd, 4th century, they come up with a way of understanding melacha that everybody should be able to categorize clearly in their minds. Some of you might have heard before the 39 avot melacha, the 39 forbidden things you're not allowed to do. That is in the Mishnah. Much of those 39 are learned from this week's Parsha and last week's Parsha because they're the things that you're not that were employed in the construction of the sanctuary. Those are the 39 labors. They include writing, building, tanning leather. It's a whole bunch of activities that were employed. I think the way to understand melacha most for all of us is melacha is doing something that will effect a permanent change, something that will endure in an altered material form. That is melacha. The reason why it's important we know what melacha is because the Torah leaves no room on issues of melacha for flexibility. Actually, it's not true. I shouldn't say the Torah leaves no room. It leaves one little piece of room for flexibility on those issues. Anyone know what it is? When am I allowed to violate a melacha? Very good. Pikuach nefesh. When a life is at stake, you are allowed to violate a melacha. It's true. You're obligated to violate the melacha when a life is at stake. Right? We see that now in the army. You have observant soldiers with guns. A gun, it lights a fire when you're shooting that gun, but nobody would say you're not allowed to use a gun on Shabbat if there's an active war. Right? You're protecting life, you're allowed to fight on Shabbat. That is a melacha. You're going to see how it's important we understand what is electricity, because if electricity is a melacha, we're in big trouble. There's very little grounds to use it. Okay? The Torah says something else about Shabbat, which you have there at the top of the page, in the first box there, number 2. Uvayom hashavi'i tishbot. On the 7th day you shall rest. Well, if the Torah already said you're not allowed to do melacha on Shabbat, what is it adding by telling us you have to rest? So this is a whole other category of Shabbat restrictions, which are called shavut, from the word lishbot, shavut. Shavut is different than melacha. Melacha, labors that are forbidden, and we believe they're forbidden in the Torah, no room for flexibility. Shavut, the Bible says you have to rest, but doesn't explain what that means. So the Talmud explains that the sages of every generation have an obligation to enact further restrictions than just the melacha, further restrictions for a few different reasons. First of all, the famous one, asu siyag la Torah. Make fences around the Torah. That's one reason. Make it more difficult for people to violate a melacha by having extra rules. A famous example is muktzah. A pen that's on your table on Saturday. Am I allowed to move it from one place to the other? Why though? The Torah doesn't say anything, but the rabbi said You might be tempted to use the pen to write a letter to a friend. And so, don't touch it. That is an example of a fence around the Torah, and that is shvut, not melacha. Another reason why the rabbis might employ a shvut is to prohibit a labor that looks very close to a melacha. It seems too close to a real melacha. Another reason why they might employ a shvut is because it's not in the spirit of Shabbat. Where in the Torah does it say, I'm not allowed to read The Economist on Shabbat? Nowhere. But is it in the spirit of Shabbat? No. So actually there's a whole bunch of laws in the Shulchan Aruch about what you're allowed to read on Shabbat, even what you're allowed to speak about on Shabbat. I remember teaching this to my father, who talks way too often about the stock market, and I told him on Saturday, you're not allowed to talk about the stock market, and he said, where is that written in the Torah? It's not written in the Torah. That's the point. There are some activities that are not in the spirit of Shabbat. Even, by the way, buying and selling. We think of that as sort of the main restriction of Shabbat, but the Torah does not say no buying and selling. But this is what we do the rest of the week. It's a way that we engage in the economy of the world. If we were doing that on Saturday too, we wouldn't be able really to understand or participate or feel what Shabbat is about. Shvut is a very special category because to me, I'm just speaking myself now, it preserves what I think is the Torah's original intent in saying, you shall do no labor, which, as I said earlier, was not to come up with 39 categories of things you can't do. I don't think if the Torah wanted to do that, it would have. Instead, I think the Torah's original intent was to say, you'll know. You'll know what you're busy with the rest of the week. And it's going to be different in the 20th century than it will be in the 11th century. I know nobody here is tanning leather and shearing their sheep. That for you is probably, if you did it on Shabbat, it would make Shabbat special. It would be just the opposite, because it's not what you're busy with the rest of the week. But I do know what you're busy with in the 20th century and the 21st century is going to be other stuff, different stuff. And Shabbat must be distinct. And Shvut is the way that we allow the rabbinic authorities, and by extension the whole community, to carve out a time and say, we're going to make this different. This will be a day devoted always to its original purposes, which is study and spirituality and community and rest, whether the activities that we're forbidding fit into 39 categories or they don't. That's Shvut. Practically speaking, what is the difference? They're both forbidden. You can't do both. But remember I said how there's a very narrow window with melacha where you can violate melacha. It's only in the case of saving a life. With Shvut, the category might be a little wider. I'll give you an example. One of the famous prohibitions of Shvut is called Amira Lenochri, giving instructions to a non-Jew to do the labor for you that you're not allowed to do. The Torah doesn't say you can't do that, but Shvut says, what kind of Shabbat is it if the world around you is looking the same and you're giving orders to just non-Jews around you to do the things that you're not allowed to do? Can I tell a non-Jew, can you light a fire for me? I'm cold. No. Can I tell a non-Jew, it's cold in here and it would be really great if someone lit a fire for me? You can. So Shavuot has a little bit of a wider array of flexibility. Also, let's say there's not a life and death situation, but maybe a medical emergency. This is a famous question that comes up in Shabbat observant communities. My wife, what happens if she goes into labor on Shabbat? How do we get to the hospital? Am I allowed to drive? So most rabbis will say, no, you are not allowed to drive to the hospital because the majority opinion out there is that operating an internal combustion vehicle, you're lighting a fire when you turn the engine on, and that's a melacha. And giving birth today is not a life or death issue. There's some doctors here, we can argue with that. But unfortunately, in some communities, the rabbis think they know more than the doctors. So they say, it's not a life or death issue, just give birth at home. But what they will say is, take an Uber. Well, hold on, I can't drive, but I can take an Uber? Right. Because an Uber, you're not lighting a fire, somebody else is, and you're using your phone, and there's no fire being lit in your phone, or you can tell a friend to order the Uber for you who's not Jewish. There's more flexibility with Shvut than there is with Melacha. Also, if the Sanhedrin gets established again tomorrow, what happens if you violate a melacha and people warn you and they see you? Don't worry, we're not going to do this here, but Chazan is correct. Death by stoning. Skila. It's very hard to establish it, and it's not clear that was ever done in Jewish history. But technically speaking, you violate a melacha, get the rocks. Shavut, what happens to you? Not karet. No, whips. And the rabbis get to whip you. It's called malkot. So if the Sanhedrin gets established tomorrow, we know what we're dealing with. This is just for nerds who study the Talmud. They know the difference between skila and malkot, where you get stoned and where you get whipped. The idea is one is a higher category of prohibition, one is a lesser category. Before I get into how an electric vehicle might fit in the middle of this puzzle, I want to review with you two major responsum of the Committee of Jewish Law and Standards, that same committee that I was talking about, that we need to familiarize ourselves with before we delve into the 2023 ones. The first is maybe the most controversial responsum ever issued by the conservative movement in 1950, called a responsum on the Sabbath. If some of you might have studied this responsum before, was written by three rabbis who said in 1950 that Jews are permitted to drive their cars to synagogue in order to get to shul on Shabbat. The truth is, that is only how it is commonly understood. The exact language I gave you here on this handout. And I think it's important to know the exact language of this responsum, because sometimes people will say, I'm a conservative Jew, I'm allowed to drive on Shabbat. Well, it's not that clear, right? Who can Rochelle, do you have it there? Could you read for me that paragraph? What does it say on the handout?
Refraining from the use of a motor vehicle is an important aid in the maintenance of the Sabbath spirit of repose. Such restraints aids, moreover, in keeping the members of the family together on the Sabbath. However, where a family resides beyond reasonable walking distance from the synagogue, the use of a motor vehicle for the purpose of synagogue attendance shall in no way be construed as a violation of the Sabbath act, On the contrary, such attendance shall be deemed an expression of loyalty to our faith.
I want you all to keep this handout. Thank you so much, Rochelle. I think it's very, very wise the way the authors of this responsum wrote that paragraph. And if you asked me what that paragraph says, it's in fact much more nuanced and complex than we give it credit for. Oh, the conservative movement allows driving on Shabbos. It says, first of all, that it's important not to drive. It also says, we're worried about how this act is construed, not about how it violates or doesn't violate Jewish law. There's much that can be said about this responsum. About 20 years ago, an entire book of responsum on this responsum was written, half of which said it was great, the other half said the worst thing that and destroyed the conservative movement. And I can't tell you how many Orthodox Jews I meet who say, this responsum is why I left the conservative movement, or this is what points to how ridiculous the conservative movement is. But they never read it and don't understand what it really says. I think when you're reading it, am I wrong, you get a sense of what the struggle is. The struggle is, in 1950, Jews are moving into the suburbs. It happened here, just like it happened in major Jewish cities all over North America. Do you think they moved there because of this responsum and said, oh, we can drive on Shabbos, now we can buy a house in North York? Okay, that's not exactly the way it happened. People moved into the suburbs for many, many different reasons. And this was a question, an active question. Should I feel guilty coming to synagogue on Shabbat, driving my car? And this responsum said, you need to construe that as an act of positive loyalty to the tradition. Don't tell people that they shouldn't come to synagogue or that they're sinners for coming to synagogue that way. This is an active issue, how that driving to synagogue ought to be construed in the Orthodox world today. If you drive by on Shabbat, the parking lot on Clark, where the bayit is, you will see, I don't know if this is still true today, but it was true years ago, the lot is closed. It's still closed on Shabbat, right? That is a message. But Chabad Bayview down the street, I asked him how he's handling this. There's no big parking lot at Chabad Bayview, Rabbi Gansberg, and he does have parking downstairs open on Shabbat. There's a active question about whether you keep the parking lot open, which means perhaps you're encouraging people to drive to shul on Shabbat, or whether you keep it closed, which sends a message that you should park around the corner. But that sends a message that, we're not happy that you're driving to shul on Shabbat. There are other Orthodox synagogues that won't give aliyahs to people who drive to Shabbat. So how ought it be regarded? And then, by the way, there's all the corollary issues. Not just about coming to synagogue on Shabbat, but what about if you have an elderly grandparent who lives in a senior's residence, and every Friday night that elderly grandparent, who could easily get a lift to your house and sit at your table for Shabbat, you tell that elderly grandparent, no, I don't want you coming over for Friday night because you're going to take a car. Do you understand the scenario with me? That is, even in the Orthodox world, this is an active issue for outside of synagogue. Can I invite my grandparent from the senior's residence to come to my house? He's not coming on his own. I'm inviting them. Can I invite somebody who's not Shabbat observant to my home when I know that they will drive? Brisses, it's a big issue here on brisses, right? I was shocked to find out that Rabbi Diamond, who's the king of circumcisions, he's not a rabbi, sorry, Abi Diamond, the circumcision king, right? When I first came to Toronto, and you know the rule, right? You're allowed to have a bris on Shabbat. That's clear. But he will almost never do them. Why? Because then guests will drive their cars to the bris, and the fact that we're having the bris on Shabbat will lead to many people desecrating Shabbat. So you see how this is an issue that has its tentacles all over Jewish life, and into some very sensitive areas that deal not just with the value of Shabbat, but with other Jewish values too, like circumcision, but also, what about human dignity? What is it like to tell an elderly grandparent, you can never come to if I move you to that senior's residence, I'm never going to invite you to my home on Shabbat. So what about issues of human dignity? What about wheel-trans and electric wheelchairs and all sorts of different aids without which people can't come to synagogue? Right? So this is an active issue and a sensitive issue, as I said. That's the first responsum that we should understand. The second responsum, 2012, written by Danny Nevins, who came here earlier in the year. He was our scholar in residence back in November, I believe. He wrote a very long responsum on electricity on the Sabbath. Now, to make it, I'm going to give the summary. He said, number one, electricity can be a melacha. How so? If I have a electric operated chainsaw that I'm going to use to cut trees, that's a melacha. Why? Because you're not allowed to cut down trees. That's a melacha on Shabbat. And your electric chainsaw, that's what it's used for. It doesn't matter that it works through electricity. You're violating a melacha. Get the rocks ready.
Isn't that a shvut rather than a melacha?
Why is it a shvut and not a melacha?
Because if you don't touch the electricity, then you won't touch the tree.
Oh, I'm not talking about turning it on. I'm talking about using it. I assume you're turning on the chainsaw in order to cut down the tree. So, harvesting is a melacha. The tolada is cutting down trees. It's definitely a melacha. You know that the Talmud says you're not even allowed to ride a horse in case that you hit a tree and you break the tree. So it's very serious. You're not allowed to cut down trees on Shabbat. And because of that, electricity to power a chainsaw, for example, could be a melacha. That's number one. He also says swimming is not a melacha.
Oh, but towels are.
Okay, that's a different story. Not towels. Wringing the towel. So that is a shvut. But there's no electricity, or you're in big trouble if you do that in the pool. He says electricity can also be a shvut. Starting to get confusing. Wait, electricity can be a melacha. It can also be a shvut. Why? Your phone, which is one of the clear ways that we try and draw a distinction between Shabbat and the rest of the week. If you're on your phone, especially checking the stock market, right, you're not violating any of the melachot, but it's considered to be against the spirit of Shabbat, which is in the shvut category, and that's not allowed. He also says electricity can be permitted. How so? He says operating a circuit, an electrical circuit, is not a violation of any, in his opinion, of any rule of Shabbat. All you're doing is directing the flow of current from one place to another. That is the same as opening up the faucet of your sink, which just directs the water from one place to another. I'm giving you his opinion.
So would he turn lights on and off on Shabbat?
So he would say, and he does say in his tshuva, that lights, especially an LED light bulb, where there's nothing, there's no incandescent filament that's being heated up in the process, he would say an LED light bulb, if it's being used in the spirit of Shabbat, which I assume it is, right? You make a mistake. You forgot to turn the lights on before Shabbat, and you're sitting down to your meal. Do you eat in the dark? He would say, no. Turn the switch on. That is not a shvut and not a melacha, because you're doing it not against the spirit of Shabbat, but precisely in the spirit of Shabbat. You can turn the light on. And in fact, at the top of your handouts, you see, it says, V'karata l'Shabbat oneg. And who says it? Isaiah? Or what it says at the top of your sheet. Who said? Isaiah. V'karata l'Shabbat oneg. That it is a mitzvah that you should enjoy Shabbat. And if I have a fan next to me, and I forgot to turn the fan on, and it's Shabbos, and I'm dying, and I'm not enjoying Shabbat anymore, he says, turn on the fan. That it is not a shvut, if used in that context, or a melacha. So other rabbis disagree with him. There are rabbis, you should know, who say electricity is always a melacha. Why? Because when the Torah, the most common explanation you'll hear is when the Torah prohibits fire, it's because it's really prohibiting energy. Fire is what powered the ancient world. Electricity is what powers our world. It's just the modern day equivalent, and it should be considered melacha. Rabbi Nevins rejects that and says, no, it all depends what you're using the electricity for. If you're using it for something that's in the spirit of Shabbat, use it. If you're using it for something that's not in the spirit of Shabbat, don't use it. That's the Nevins Responsa. So you have the 1951 and the 2012 one, and we have to combine them in 2023. And two responsum are issued. Now, I know people get crazy with that. They say, how can the conservative movement say it's allowed and it's not allowed at the same time? This happened, by the way, also in the homosexuality papers in 2006. There was a paper that said forbidden, there was a paper that said permitted, and the biggest criticism was, how can you say two things on the same thing? Well, welcome to Jewish law. Sadly, there is no Supreme Court of Judaism. The way Judaism works is smart rabbis issue their opinions, and there are 70 faces to the Torah, and it's our responsibility to use our brains. This is why this class is important, to use our brains, to think for ourselves, and to decide which paper, which approach makes the most sense to us. So it's not something crazy that two different opinions are issued. What's a little bit crazy is that they knew, the head of the committee knew that the permissive paper was going to be issued and wanted to make sure that at the same time a restrictive paper was written as well to cover his behind. Right? We'll get people less upset if there's also a paper saying it's not allowed. Chazan.
My question is if you mentioned rabbis might come up with some explanations that some of these things are permitted. Would they take responsibility officially once they write the tshuva as such for everyone who would follow them in the future, or the onus stays on the person following them?
Every person in Judaism is responsible himself or herself for abiding by the laws and restrictions that make sense to them. I'll give you the perfect example. You go into a restaurant and you hear that you see the te'udah on the wall. Are you allowed to eat at that restaurant if you don't recognize the name of the rabbi on that te'udah? This doesn't happen in Toronto because it's all COR, but it's very common in Israel. It's common in Mexico. I was telling Tibi I was in Mexico. In Mexico, you see a te'udah on the wall, it's the name of a rabbi. Can I eat the food and just say, look, this could be pork, but that rabbi says it's not, so I'm good? Right? No, you are required to investigate and ask, who is this rabbi? And then you find out that rabbi died 30 years ago. And these stories happen, right? So you are responsible yourself to follow what makes sense to you. This is a religion that believes in education, in every person making an educated decision for themselves according to what's right. Aseh lecha rav, make for yourself a guide, a rabbi, a teacher. Tu responsum. Let's deal with the permissive one first. Written by Rabbi David Fine, who I've known for many years. I actually worked for him in New York. And Barry Leff. You have that beneath you, their conclusions. I'll summarize it for you briefly. They conclude that the 1950 Teshuvah was correct. That the way they, in 1950, understood the prohibition of lighting fire, whereby they found grounds to permit the operation of an internal combustion engine vehicle, that is correct. And that it is not a melacha even to drive an internal combustion engine car to synagogue. Number one. Number two, they say Rabbi Nevins, in his approach to electricity, is correct. It all depends on what you're using the electricity for, but electricity in itself is not a Shabbat prohibition. So their conclusions flow from there. And they say operating an electric vehicle on Shabbat is even slightly better than a internal combustion vehicle, because even though we think an internal combustion engine is still permitted as long as you're going to synagogue, because it does not fall under the category of a melacha, even though we think that's the case, we do recognize that some people think that lighting fire even in an internal combustion engine is a melacha, and it would be better, therefore, that they take an electric vehicle. That is their first.
What about a stove?
Well, this responsum was specifically about an electric vehicle. A stove, I think everybody would say, is a melacha. Why? You're cooking. Cooking is a melacha, right? But you're not cooking in heat. But you're not cooking, I hope, in your car. So, an electric vehicle, in their opinion, is better. Even though they would say, only if you're going to do something that is Shabbat appropriate. This goes back to the Rabbi Nevin's paper. Electricity is permitted if you're using it for something that's in the spirit of Shabbat. It is not permitted to go to Six Flags or to Canada's Wonderland, but it is appropriate if you're taking it to synagogues. Yes, sir.
What does that word better mean, or preferable? Like better in the eyes of God, better in the people who might be against it? Like I don't really understand what it's at.
Right.
You can still drive to Shabbat in a regular, car. This is better, but I don't understand what that means.
So that's a really good question. It goes back to what I said at the beginning of the talk. Seth says, what does that mean, better? I think conceptually it really helps to understand Shabbat observance as a spectrum. That the more I can do to honor Shabbat, the better it is. But if I can only do so much, I shouldn't just say, I'm quitting because I can't do everything. And so part of what both papers try to do is to say, here's the best way of honoring Shabbat. At the end of the spectrum is walking. The best way. Why? Because we believe that walking is most in keeping with the Torah's intentions when it thinks of what Shabbat ought to be. A day where we experience life slowly, where we're living in community. That is closer to what the Torah imagines. If you can't do that, if you can't go that far down the spectrum, do a bicycle. Why bicycle? Because you don't bike to work, most people, the rest of the week. Biking is still slower than driving. It's a different kind of way of transporting yourself that reminds you, this is Shabbat. I'm doing something today on Shabbat. I'm biking to synagogue, which is not something I do the rest of the week. There's no engine, and it's better. A little worse than that, an electric car. A little worse than that, the internal combustion. And I didn't mention, by the way, they also deal with public transportation, which also, according to many people, what's up? They're finished. Okay, but they finished early. I still have 5 minutes to the last one. Not fair. Okay, so let me just get to the last paper and then I'll take a couple of questions. The first paper says, look at Shabbat that way as a spectrum and recognize that electric driving, if you're going to synagogue, you shouldn't feel guilty about it at all. In fact, you should feel proud because I'm violating Shabbat. I'm acting more in the spirit of Shabbat than I would be in an internal combustion engine. That's paper number 1. Paper number 2 is the restrictive paper. Again, keep this handout so you can read it. By a rabbi in London, Rabbi Weiner and Rabbi Schwartz. Moshe Schwartz actually was another speaker who came to Beth Tikvah once. They wrote the restrictive paper. This is what they said about the 1950s tshuva. The 1950 tshuva, they said, well-intentioned. Why well-intentioned? Because they saw Jews moving into the suburbs, were very nervous that that was going to be a catastrophe for Jewish life, and therefore found some way to make Jews feel comfortable driving their cars to shul on Shabbat in the suburbs. Well-intentioned, but halachically incorrect. That is not a sufficient reason to allow the lighting of an internal combustion engine, which they feel is still a melacha. You're lighting fire. That's number 1. Number 2, the Nevin's tshuva. What did they say about that? They disagree with Rabbi Nevins in the way he understands electricity, saying that electricity can never be permitted, even for the lights, even for a fan. Why can it never be permitted, even when it's in the spirit of Shabbat? Because of the way a circuit works. A circuit, they feel, violates a shvut, a rabbinic prohibition, because as we learned, any labor that looks like melacha, one of the grounds that you prohibit melacha is a similar labor that looks like melacha, even if it's not. So going back to my chainsaw, actually that's a bad example because a chainsaw is always prohibited, but let's talk about an electric car. The experience of driving an electric car is very similar to the experience of driving an internal combustion car. It looks like it, it smells like it, the same traffic, the same motion, turning on the radio. And the whole point, according to these rabbis, of Shvut is to prohibit activities that also look and feel like a melacha, even if it's not a melacha. So that is why they prohibit the driving an electric vehicle. They just say it's too close and too similar, even if it's not a melacha. Now, saying that, there are grounds where they say you should be taking, or you could be obligated to take an electric vehicle and shouldn't be worried about it. Why? Shvut, remember, is more flexible than melacha. How could it be more flexible? Going back to all of those questions of human dignity that I talked to you about before. Do you feel guilty that you're elderly, you can't get to an elderly grandparent senior's residence on Friday night? That's a mitzvah to be together on Friday night. That's an experience of Shabbat. Take an electric car. That's better than an internal combustion car. What else? Let's say there's a family simcha and it's further away. That's very important. If you're not there, you're missing out on an event that's going to sustain family relationships. So they find at the same time flexibility with an electric car that they don't find with an internal combustion vehicle. So even though you might say one is restrictive and one is permissive, it's actually more complex than that. And what these two papers are inviting you to do, and they're free to look at online, and you have their conclusions here, what they're inviting you to do is, number one, understand why we have these rules on Shabbat in the first place. If we don't have uniform communal standards and everybody just does whatever they want, you can't observe Shabbat together. And it's important to observe Shabbat together. And they also are saying, understand that Shabbat is a spectrum. And we want, as rabbis, to encourage people to observe Shabbat in the most ideal way that they can. But everybody has different circumstances. Everybody has their own story. And it's important to understand what issues people are dealing with in order to navigate a Shabbat that is as much as good as a Shabbat as they can possibly have. And that's how I like to look at these papers. Not to say to you, driving is allowed or driving is not allowed, but to ask people one-on-one, what are the issues that you're dealing with for your Shabbat? Where do you live? Right? What is the event that you want to go to? What is the reason why you want to take that car? Where are you going? What is the ideal Shabbat look like for you? And are there differences within your family in terms of the way people observe? This has implications for us as a synagogue, I think, because we now find ourselves in a location where there are very few Jews who live within walking distance. And I think that this tshuva opens up for us, both of them, opens up for us a way of helping people observe Shabbat even more, even if they don't live within close distance. That is, even somebody who says, I would never join Beth Tikvah because I don't feel comfortable driving on Shabbat. If they haven't found a synagogue that they like and they're falling away from community, and it would be great if they would just come here, we could offer them, well, let me take you to the Beth Tikvah's giving a $500 rebate for every Tesla purchase. Just kidding, right? But there are ways to find, okay, let me help you make your Shabbat a little bit more closer to the ideal. Thank you very much, everyone. I hope you learned a little bit about Shabbat, and I'm sticking around if you want to ask more questions. Sorry we didn't have time. It tends to happen. Shabbat Shalom.